one of the most beautiful arias from the Messiah by Handel is inspired by the text in Isaiah 52:7. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news. We will begin with the herald that prepares the way of the Lord. Thank you for listening to another tidbit from the book of Isaiah. Today we are focusing on the grand climax of the servant songs in the book of Isaiah, that is usually called chapter 53, even though the song as such begins in verse 13 of the previous chapter. But before we reach to the poem itself, we will listen to the preparation, because from verse 7 to 12 in chapter 52, the herald preparing the way for the Lord is described. His feet are beautiful. First of all, we read that in the Old Testament. When you speak about human beings, you will often emphasize one element of their body in order to speak about the whole of that person, because that particular element emphasizes a unique role that person has in this context. Here, when you have a herald that is running in front of the king to proclaim he is on his way, the feet are beautiful. And then, listen, who proclaim peace, who bring good tidings, reading from New International Version, who proclaim salvation. The phrase good tidings, as the one who bring good tidings or good news, is actually the origin of the term evangelion. Evangelion, a good message or good news, is a Greek translation of this term, which you find a couple of times in the book of Isaiah. You also find it in chapter 68 of Psalms, in describing Deborah, the judge. So, the one who brings good tidings is the one who tells the Lord is on his way. Listen, your watchmen, lift off their voices. Verse 8 in chapter 7. Together they shout for joy. When the Lord returns to Zion, they will see it with their own eyes. Some of the expressions here remind you of, if you remember, chapter 40 in the book, where the glory of the Lord will be seen by everyone, because the Lord is returning to Mount Zion, returning to the temple, returning to Jerusalem. And then you have this expression in verse 9, burst into song of joy together, you ruins of Jerusalem, for the Lord has comforted his people. Comfort ye, as in Isaiah 40 verse 1, he has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord will lay bare his holy arm in the sight of all nations, and all the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our Lord. So, the salvation of the Lord is here parallel with the revelation of his arm. That is what he has done, because the arm is the one with which you act, your right hand. And that we will meet a little later. And then you have, in the context of Isaiah, where the people is in captivity in Babylon, you have the appeal, depart, depart, go out from there. That is, go out from Babylon. You have the experience of a new exodus, like in the old days, the exodus from Egypt. You will not have to leave in haste or go in flight, for the Lord will go before you. The God of Israel will be your rear guard, just as in the wilderness wandering on the way home to the promised land. And then in verse 13, you begin the actual poem. This is the climax of the poems about servants of the Lord throughout the latter part of Isaiah. You have a description of Israel as the servant of the Lord, the prophet. You have Cyrus, the Persian king, as the servant of the Lord. Now you are narrowing down to an individual servant of the Lord, an individual that takes upon him the sufferings of the people. The poem has 5 parts. In translations, you will find 3 verses, 13 to 15, in the last part of chapter 52, and then you have 12 verses in chapter 53, 3 verses from each in our present versification. So that's 1 in 52 and 4 in chapter 53, 5 parts. Scholars usually realize there are 5 parts, and they are also structured. Typically, as many Old Testament texts, structures in parallels. Now here the structure is a chiastic structure, so you have a center. You have 1 and 5 that somehow matches. You have 2 and 4, and then in the middle, number 3 is the center. The first one speaks about the exaltation of the servant. Then you speak about his humiliation. Then in verse 4 to 7, you have his atonement, the atonement that he makes for the people. Then in verses 7 to 9, once again, you have humiliation. And in the latter, or last stanza from verse 10 to 12, you have his exaltation or glorification once again. So, exaltation, humiliation, atonement, humiliation, and exaltation. Let's look at the verses that speak about the exaltation. In verse 13 of 52, see, my servant will act wisely. This is a royal attribute. The typical messianic king, as described in Isaiah 11, is a person who acts and rules with wisdom. Then it is said about him, he will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. If you read the book of Isaiah, you will realize that these expressions are core expressions in the book. Only one is exalted on the day of judgment. That is the Lord himself. You read in chapter 2 about the judgment, all that is high and lofty, all humans that are proud, they will be humiliated. In chapter 6, the prophet has a vision of the Lord in his temple, most likely the heavenly temple, who is high and lifted up on his throne. In chapter 14, the enemy, the power, the spiritual power behind the king of Babylon, is trying to raise himself up on the throne of God to take his place. And here you have someone who is the opposite of that enemy of the people. He is humble, but he will be exalted. This is background for a New Testament text like Philippians 2, where Jesus, one with God, became a human being, humiliated himself, emptied himself, died on the cross, and then again is exalted. This exaltation comes after his suffering. And then Isaiah speaks in verse 14, just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance also disfigured beyond that of any man, his form marred beyond human likeness. He's worse than any other human in immediate impression. This is a paradox. So he will sprinkle many nations and so on. Kings will shut their mouth because of him. The paradox, see, the king is coming. You have the herald proclaiming his coming. The salvation will be revealed. The arm of the Lord will be seen. In the next line, verse 1 in 53, who has believed our message and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? And the paradox is then that as other kings will look at this event and say, now the king of Zion has arrived, then what they see is a suffering servant with no appearance to attract the crowd, no glory in normal human terms. Later on in chapter 57, verse 15, the phrase is used about the Lord himself. Notice that. I'll just find the verse here. This is what the high and the lofty one says. And this is a reference to these expressions, the Hebrew participles of the verbs rum and nasa, which are used in 52 verse 13, are here repeated. He who lives forever, whose name is holy. This is God himself. I live in a high and holy place, but also with him who is contrite and lowly in spirit. So, this is a paradox. The king that is coming, who is proclaimed by the herald in 52:7 and onwards, is a suffering servant. So, let me move on here. He is now humbled, he is rejected, and in verses 4 to 6 in chapter 53, you have the words about his atonement. Notice how strongly it's said. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Yet we consider him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him. By his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. This is suffering as a sacrifice in place of the people of God, in place of you and me. So here you have God himself revealed in a human being, in a servant, humbling himself to sacrifice himself for the sins of the people. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. As a sheep before the shears, he was silent. He did not open his mouth. Now, a couple of questions. Remember, this is poetry. This is not even like the prophecies of Nostradamus. This is prophecy in poetry with a strong theological aim. But it's still poetry. Some people would ask questions like, when it is said in verse 10 that he will see offspring and prolong his days. But Jesus didn't get children, did he? Now, this is a poetic way of speaking. He had descendants in a spiritual sense. It was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer, and so on. But there will be an end result. And notice, if you are in doubt that this was a person who died in order to atone, then let's read just the last portion. Because he poured out his life unto death. That is dying. He was numbered with transgressors. He bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. He still makes intercession. He's the only one who has a legal right to do so, who has character of love to make it happen to you and me. Thank you for listening to this tidbit. So much more could be said about this wonderful prophecy. I hope this has at least inspired you to read, to study more about the servant of the Lord. Thank you.